Hey there! Welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, it's a big one for another unscripted movie review. Haven't done one of these in a while. We're going to be talking about the newest summer blockbuster epic from Christopher Nolan, The Odyssey. So, I think there is two ways in which I can approach conversation with this movie, because when I originally tried to sit down and film something that's more unscripted, side note, there's been a lot of takes with this, is that I wanted to open with a lot of preamble, setting a lot of the context in which I am approaching this, because I do think some of that context is relevant. I could talk about how when I came up and discovered a lot of Greek mythology and Norse mythology and the interweavings of mythology across culture, I could say Hero from a Thousand Faces, Joseph Campbell, but I could also point towards the fact that I found one of my mom's mythology textbooks from university when I was in junior high, and I read a lot of that, and I really became enamored with it. I can talk about the other myths in the Greek canon that I liked. I'm more partial to Jason and the Argonauts or Theseus than I am for like the Illiad or the Odyssey. Interesting historical and cultural hang-ups, a lot of which are absorbed through, well, the vast cultural differences and societal differences we have between the ancient Greeks of millennia ago and the number of the adaptations and translations and wherever it ends up now. Inevitably, details change or are lost. Certain themes are emphasized, then de-emphasized, then potentially re-emphasized again. I also want to stress that I saw and read and watched a lot of reviews and analysis of The Odyssey before actually going to go sit down and watch the movie in IMAX, which I did. I did this specifically because sometimes Christopher Nolan is the filmmaker where if you're not in the appropriate headspace to capture onto the threads in which he's sketching, sometimes you can land on them very directly, sometimes you will bounce off of them. And in general, I prefer to talk a little bit more about themes and ideas and how that interweaves with execution, and thus having some of the reviews in the backdrop helps lay some of the foundation for exploring those themes. That's a lot of backdrop, that's a lot of baggage that I'm bringing into it, but I also think it's relevant to mention that baggage because there's a lot of people in discussing movies like The Odyssey have their own degree of historical baggage and cultural expectations that they're taking and maybe experiencing the film with rapturous praise or a certain amount of reactionary backlash because this film happens to cast a trans man and an extraordinarily beautiful black woman as Helen of Troy. I mean, you just show all your cards right there, especially given the amount of talent that is on display. I have no idea why the reactionary right tried to choose Christopher Nolan and The Odyssey as their next target. I mean, you'd think he would be one of their allies or someone to aspire to, but then again, it's more revealing of some of their own anti-intellectual strains. Trust me, we're going to get into that too. In any case, I had a lot of baggage going into this. I was really excited to see this movie, even with a certain amount of trepidation, because I like Nolan as a filmmaker, but I don't love him. I've never been the biggest fan of Interstellar. Tenet kind of bounced off of me. I don't really like Dunkirk to this day. And while Oppenheimer is indeed great, it's also a film that I probably wouldn't put among my absolute favorites of his. I mean, The Dark Knight is still there. I think Nolan's got a certain reputation in some film nerd circles that is both overemphasized and underemphasized for very specific reasons that I think are a little bit more revealing of those doing the emphasis than anyone else. But enough lollygagging around. Let's talk about the movie. It's very good. Yeah, it's a very good summer blockbuster. I'm not surprised that it's making all of the money right now. I think it is very good. I do not think it's great. And part of that has to do with an exploration of a lot of Christopher Nolan's thematic arcs, pairing it with an execution that feels weirdly tentative to go as far as it probably needed to in order to draw forth and hammer home its point. And I think that does play to a certain conservatism around Nolan as a filmmaker that will cause plenty of moments to be altogether awesome, but also restrained in ways that may do the overarching product a disservice. So yes, it's a very good movie, but I don't think it's great, and we'll get to why in a little bit. First off, I want to talk about cast. The biggest star here is Anne Hathaway. I do see the potential of her getting nominated for Academy Awards here. She delivers a truly magnetic presence. I think she is, irregardless of whatever choices of dialogue they did for a movie like this, the fact she was so willing and committed to the moment was phenomenal. Easily the star of the show. Also high praise for Jon Bernthal, who played Menelaus, who I think has a really scrappy, ragged energy to it really carries the scene and really highlights some of the brutish natures that come encircled around this specific era of Greek mythos. Again, Lupita N'yongo is great in her dual role. Not going to fully explore what that is. If you know your Greek myths, you know you know. And I will also say that Tom Holland as Telemachus is good. Again, he feels like a very modernized casting, and a lot of his diction and presentation plays as such, and that's going to be relevant later. I also say that Robert Pattinson, I don't always believe him as a straightforward hero in some proceedings, but he is a fantastic villain, and as one of the lead suitors who plays a terrific slimeball, he is great in this. Ironically, one of the people who I think is probably the one that I kind of wished I liked a lot more was Matt Damon as Odysseus. Not that he is bad in what he's trying to do. I think he is a pretty impressive actor playing a certain gruff stoicism that Nolan clearly prizes. But again, it is in some of the differences and separations that are built off of the Odyssey, the poem, and a number of adaptations to what we have now. It produces a little bit of dissonance in terms of what you would normally expect from Odysseus. And I don't always think Matt Damon is the best fit for bridging that gap. And I think that, again, bridging that cultural gap and that literary gap is going to become very relevant in terms of discussing the Odyssey as a whole. The one person I think is actually worse from Nolan here is Charlize Theron. As Calypso, I think Calypso is a much more interesting character, and I gotta be honest, I feel like a lot of that was demystified in how Nolan has chosen to present her. But then again, demystification is something that around larger supernatural or surrealist elements, that is something that unfortunately is a little bit of a standby with Nolan. Take a look at how we adapted Batman, and it's not exactly surprising, but it was a little bit disappointing given how fearsome Calypso can otherwise be. I'll also say for Zendaya, in terms of how she played Athena, she certainly captured an ethereal strangeness to her presentation, especially in terms of it's juxtaposed with how her character was also portrayed in a different setting. I think that was executed very well. Around that level of detaching from some of the surrealism, one comparison I've seen folks make is to The Green Knight, which is an adaptation of the Green Knight mythos from Arthurian legend, but also has the A24 reputation of being a little diffuse, more rely on a little bit of the strange abstract in the filmmaking technique rather than a very strong script. I'll gotta be honest, I really wish I liked The Green Knight a lot more than I did, because it was set up to be exactly my sort of thing and be exactly as nerdy and weird as I was hoping. I'll admit the script kind of let that one down a little bit, even if it is a gorgeous movie. The one larger thing that I will bring up with that, and I think is relevant to discussing the Odyssey, is that both films represent the fact that if you're going back to these historical ages that is pre-medicine, pre the larger human understanding of the world, there is the strange, the surreal, the unquantifiable that will come across as magical and not understood. And it adds that heady, kind of caked over dirty texture that really goes off effectively. For the most part, that is relevant when talking about the Odyssey. This is where I'm also going to put in a brief tangent here, because a lot of folks have emphasized the level of practical effects that were done in this movie, how it feels more tactile and more dirty, more lived in than a lot of the standard green screen overload that comes out of, let's say, the MCU. I get that criticism, I get that sort of observation and that praise. It is a strikingly looking movie, absolutely worth seeing on IMAX. But I would also add the caveat that a lot of folks emphasizing the abundance of practical effects and kind of disparaging visual effects as regard kind of don't have the acknowledgement of how much Good visual effects are often good because you don't notice them. They're touching up, they're repairing things, they're doing a lot of covering work. Also, there are a lot of visual effects in a movie like this. I happen to be married to someone who works in visual effects, and she highlights again what a lot of people are saying is all practical in larger movies like this isn't really true. There is often like 1,000-person crew who works specifically on visual effects. And more specifically, there's highlighting the relevance that when you have a filmmaker as skilled as Nolan to be able to blend and merge visual effects and practical effects, that's where you often get the greatest forms of magic. A lot of things have been highlighted as the Cyclops being presented as this giant, 60-foot tall puppet. But there was also a lot of visual effects layered on top of that and makes use of great filmmaking that's behind the camera in order to add texture, identify how light bounces off of the object, how the object might move in space. That's actually a really cool blend of the two, and a lot of the backlash to visual effects often should be better focused as a backlash to pedestrian or bad filmmaking. A lot of that comes at the problem of directors, bad producers, the abundance of reshoots, shooting with unfinished scripts, that whole like. But now we're getting on to the meat of things, and I have a number of critiques that might come across as, this is spoiler alert, but this poem is also thousands of years old. It's dense, it's long, it's worth it. It's a classic. One thing I will say is that the thematic arc that is taken with the Odyssey, it's not explicitly a straightforward story. It's Nolan, that's not surprising, but it's told partially out of nested flashbacks from actually Odysseus in his time with Calypso, lost years of his memory with her. You get scenes that go beyond what you would expect in terms of just the Odyssey. You see flickers of the Trojan horse, the fall of Troy, the fallout that came from the Illiad with certain kings going back to their kingdoms in Greece and realizing really the comeuppance of their actions. Agamemnon springs to mind there. I like that Nolan includes a lot of this alongside several nods to other archaeological discussions and discourse, specifically around the people of the sea that has prompted a lot of discourse, what led to the collapse of the Bronze Age, which is also literally cited in terms of the movie's discourse. In fact, one of the larger conversations here, especially around the Odyssey, is how much of it is framed as the destruction of Troy, the Trojan War, has led to a larger downfall that is sprawling across this section of the Mediterranean, at least until the Iron Age a couple hundred years later. And this is where I will highlight Nolan's focus on tradition, is a lot of what's tied into the ideas of Zeus's law, where if you are specifically to entertain a guest, where if a guest has come in, you cannot be assured that they are not a god in disguise, thus you must entertain them, you must offer your home to them. It leads at one point to so many suitors coming after Odysseus's wife, Penelope, specifically so that she can be giving up Ithaca to them, with Odysseus being gone for damn near a decade, but it also comes into a fundamental violation of Zeus's law through the treachery of the Trojan horse. A lot of this Nolan is making very specific in order to draw a naturalistic parallel through the collapse of an ancient empire, ancient eras, where there is decorum and math and art and a level of civilization towards barbarism, and potentially highlighting that we could be heading towards something similar. This is why I've seen some parallels highlighting that the nuclear elements being explored throughout Oppenheimer are a direct parallel to now seeing that societal collapse play through in the Odyssey. It's almost as if Nolan, as a filmmaker, might have opinions about what's going on in the modern era. And I think there is some truth in that, because one thing that I will highlight as a criticism is that, and this has drawn a lot of critique, everyone in the Odyssey talks with the sort of language that I'm using now. It's colloquial, it's very familiar English. It's not the stately, bolded British accent and style that you saw in the classic era of old Hollywood that might emphasize a certain grandiosity in its presentation. It's supposed to come across as more accessible to the audience. And you see that some of that with also costuming, which also very clearly is designed to be more arch and representative of an era and stylism rather than be directly historically accurate. I actually kind of really like this specifically when it comes to some of the costuming. Like how Agamemnon's armor makes him look like this brutish hulking titan, very clearly designed to call forth to the imperial forces that would later be then brought low by their own hubris. Tied down to men that speak in a language and where, yeah, this is an ancient poem, but its lessons can indeed be accessible to the modern generation. I will say it does test my patience with the score. Ludwig Göransson comes back and does some admirable work. I think the sound design of this movie is genuinely impressive, but I also think there's not a recognizable melodic motif or even percussion motif that really grabs me throughout the course of this movie. I do think that the music is kind of not all that special overall. And in that element, I also think that it was a choice to use modern language with the assumption that it is to be making a more modernistic point. This has been done before. One of the films that Christopher Nolan cited as inspiration for his version of the Odyssey is The Last Temptation of Christ, with a lot of elements that would be emblematic and representative to the time in which the film was made, not in which the story is being told. You can tell the Odyssey is operating on a similar time-bended presentation, where the film is very clearly trying to draw more attention and relevance to us now than simply just recreating the classic text. Of course, there is certain tensions there. One of the big tensions that emerges here, and it comes down to some of Nolan's conservatism and really how he frames great men and his great heroes. Namely, that these are great men and great heroes that must suffer aggressively, almost Malthusian, in how they are rendered and brought low and must struggle and fight to survive. And only by great men adhering to their codes, adhering to honor by the very end, might they find some course of salvation at the very end. It's the second Nolan movie that has its main protagonist ride off into the sunset with Anne Hathaway. And in that regard, I think that that is something that is, again, very rooted in a conservative framing, in that a lot of it is based off of that. There are systems around them, and the systems might not be perfect. In fact, they may be corrupted and they may be abused, but you can't change or deconstruct the system. In fact, the collapse of the system towards barbarism is what will ultimately render men low. And the preservation of that system, the preservation of the institutions of slavery, of the fact that Anne Hathaway's character has sat on the throne for 20 years as a queen, but has never been granted the same vested authority as her husband. It's framed that she can rule, so why isn't she allowed to? And for Nolan's mind, it would simply be framed as that is the way it is. It is not fair, it is unjust, and there's a part of him that views it as a visceral struggle, often to see his strongest characters be crushed beneath that suffering and have to climb their way out, often brought low by both external threat and the threats within, but then come out the other side, they will indeed be better. They will reassume the throne. They will climb out of the pit. This city is more than ready to believe in good. It's fascinating here because that's not really like Odysseus. The weird thing, having read the Illiad and the Odyssey, is that Odysseus is very much more of a rake than he is presented in as this stoic macho archetype that Nolan is framing him as. Now, he does still make calamitously bad decisions, like all of the encounter with the Cyclops, which is offending Poseidon. That's a major factor in terms of Odysseus going wrong and being lost at sea for effectively a decade, less due to Odysseus' own appetites or his own misadventures or his own things that would have been considered flaws or failings within a Greek context, in comparison with the almost Christian framing of morality that is coming down on high from Nolan, at least the Christian conservative framing of morality. And that's an interesting point of tension, especially when you recognize that I think Nolan as a filmmaker behind the camera has a lot of confidence that the audience will keep up with his casting decisions, with his framing, with what he puts on screen. But as a writer, it feels like he is dragging his audience tooth and nail to try to possibly understand where all this is coming from. And maybe fair to him, like for all of those who do not remember the Odyssey, you might need a little bit more backstory to understand and reiterate certain things, hammering over and over again, otherwise known as the Netflix design of dialogue writing, where you have to constantly iterate what's happening on screen because everyone's assuming at their second screening. But when the screen is IMAX size, you can't look anywhere else, Nolan. We try to assume that we can follow along. But then again, given some of the neo-reactionaries who are basically trying to make you their next scapegoat, maybe you had to make it as blunt as you did. Anyway, tangent aside, it does mean that there's a part of me that was hoping that there was a little bit more reverence for some specific, more stately passages from the original poem, with the hope and general assumption that the audience would keep up. I didn't initially mind the choice to go for more colloquial language because I would have immediately caught on to, oh, he's trying to make a point about today. But at the same time, I also think you can make a historically relevant and a little bit more grounded in a version of history that could have maintained some of the beautiful poetry that came out of that piece, and it would still feel relevant. Look at Lord of the Rings. It's a classic example of that. So much of Lord of the Rings is taken deliberately from Tolkien's text and can still feel relevant and preserve some of that beautiful prose. Whereas here, I'm not sure it always gets there. Now, granted, I'm saying this with context that is built out of material that's come from translations. I'm saying this with context of, I might be thinking of a version of the Odyssey's text that might not be representative of what's actually in the ancient Greek. I might be missing some cultural nuances. In fact, I'm almost certain that I am. A lot of my context around what I would expect to be seen in an Odyssey movie was one that was shaped by other movies. It was shaped by other representations of what Greek literature and Greek myth was to be represented on screen. Is it that different that I'm trying to meet myself where his is instead of trying to force it to conform to mine? That's an interesting question. I think that's one that's relevant when you're actually talking about when considering this movie, especially from the reactionary point of view, who oftentimes are pointing at even worse bastardizations of the source material. Anyone who's coming here and saying that the 2004 movie Troy with Brad Pitt as Achilles is a better representation of what was proposed from the ancient Greek in comparison with elements that are more thematically rooted and also felt more broadly culturally rooted in what Nolan did, because Nolan is a classicist after all, I think they're out of their mind. And they're also just flat out wrong, and they should probably go back to actually read the fucking Illiad. One other point I want to really drill down on here is how the gods are presented, because that's also something that did irk me some in terms of how Nolan showcases the more mystical sides of the world. He does show the whirlpool. He shows Circe's brand of magic. And on that note, that whole transformation scene of his troops into pigs is one of the most graphically visceral and unpleasant things that I have seen on screen in some time. Yeesh. I do appreciate that a lot of the monsters or the framing of magic had some of that surrealist Green Knight quality. Where Nolan seems to be a lot more hesitant on is any direct portrayal of the gods, so much as the broad coincidences that draw forth the expectation that it could be considered divine, the unexplicable, the unquantifiable. He references Zeus's laws, and you occasionally will hear the cracks of thunder, but even in the movie it's highlighted, is that just coincidence? Or is this some shared social order that we've all chosen to buy into? Did you really offend Poseidon, or was it your own hubris that left you lost at sea? The funniest joke about the Odyssey is that it couldn't have been made by a woman, because this is 11 years of men traveling without asking for directions. Insert chief lap track here. But the thing is that it's an interesting question about the gods, because oftentimes the Greek gods in that chorus had a much bigger hand in meddling in the lives of mortals, because that was true across both the Iliad and the Odyssey. They were much more hands-on in their portrayal, where it's left considerably more abstract across Nolan's work. Another area where I would highlight this is the whole passage with the sirens, where a lot of what their song was like was conveyed through a monologue from Matt Damon. Probably his best monologue in the entire movie, in my opinion. But also, it's a moment where a lot of the abstract what the sirens are and their powers are is so far removed from what's actually something that could have been more mystical or magical. That's kind of disappointing. And I also say that's true with Calypso, who was originally in the poem a much more powerful presence. And I'll be honest, Nolan's demystification of her as being more wayfish, a little bit more tied to realism, or even a contemporary version of what that realism is, that struck me as a missed opportunity. But again, Nolan does this in order to make them appear more grounded. By grounded, I mean a very specific, very conservative flattening of what could be a more mystical or sexualized element. That's the other thing. While there is a lot of violence in this movie, there is a decided lack of sex, more implied than anything that actually occurs on screen. I think that's a mistake when any sort of adaptation of what you would come from Greek myth, given how bawdy a lot of it can be. I think, again, major mistake there. But as a whole, I like the Odyssey. I don't love it. Where I feel like the primary point of tension lies is in the adaptation of something where Nolan very clearly wanted to push it through a larger theme around societal collapse, and that by abandoning of our norms that we will further hasten into it, and that it requires great men to suffer greatly in order to hold things together. But that doesn't mean we change systems. That means oftentimes a system has its inherent value and should be placed up upon a pedestal. Sometimes that's not always true. These are systems that relied on slavery. These were systems that had deliberate interrogations of them within the text, but no one kind of shies away from being as bold or daring as he is to really deconstruct them. There is deconstructive elements in how this applies to our era, and there are elements that I genuinely think are truly spellbinding in terms of actors committing to the role. Like, I didn't talk much around Tom Holland and a lot of his performance, but you can watch his performance evolve throughout the course of the movie as someone who comes across more boyish and unassured in comparison with where he eventually arrives. Pay no attention to how the sequel to the Odyssey has him behave alongside his mother to Odysseus later. Again, there are some changes in adaptation that I actually do think were made for the right reasons, otherwise the Odyssey would have ended on a real downbeat note. But at the end of the day, I do think it is impressive to interrogate the movie with the expectation that it could be a lens that is of its own, and it's a lens that might mirror where my expectations are coming from, the understanding where others' expectations are coming from, even the really, really bad ones. Like, the reason that a lot of neo-reactionaries want the Odyssey to be presented in a certain way has less to do with the actual text, and has a lot more to do with their own ingrained societal expectations. So when he faces some of that backlash, and he responds to it rather mildly, all things considered, as a true conservative, he misses the forest for the trees. It's why you have weird points of tension in the execution where he hopes the audience will follow along for parts, but not all of it. It's not quite contempt for the audience, but it is the lingering disappointment that they can't be better, and it leads to him being a little more hesitant as a filmmaker in certain regards. Now, The Odyssey is still a tremendously confident movie, in that it actually wants to be a movie and not a TV series or a mark checked off of a studio balance sheet. But at the same time, it also feels like a more inventive, a more daring filmmaker who is willing to embrace the other elements that do not conform to Nolan's conservatism, could have pushed the Odyssey in more challenging places. That's not saying that this movie is, again, bad. It's not. The cast is really game for it. The combat is incredible. I think a lot of the filming, especially with the IMAX cameras, is stunning. The blend of visual effects and practical effects make everything feel so lived in, reflect a society that is being brought low by the violation of its established norms. It's powerful. The conflation with that, with the Bronze Age collapse, it's extremely on the nose in the text, but hey, it feels mostly earned. And there are some scenes I think are genuinely fantastic. The whole passage in Hades, or adjacent to Hades, when the film gets more pronounced and pagan, was easily my favorite part of the entire movie, because that's where it captured, again, some of that magic. And Nolan has a skill, genuinely, in capturing the things that are of tradition but unquantifiable, where men who are strong men are forced to engage with something that they cannot and will never potentially understand. The whole scene in Hades, again, was awesome, especially calling back to what happened with Agamemnon when he returned home. So again, you've probably all gone to see the movie. If I were to pose a question to all of you beyond the expected in the comments, the one would be is that if you have questions with how you understood the framing and references of this movie, where there's some points of tension I could not reconcile, I'm curious where yours are. I think it's all better that we try to understand the lens in which we approach art, our own personal lenses. That's why art is subjective, because every single one of those lenses will be fundamentally different. But at the same time, there are shared common elements, and the best parts of art, especially on such a grand scale, especially when it's tied to myth-making, that Nolan understands, they share some level of universality in what they are presented, that if they do not call forth truth in interpretation, they can call forth a combined conversation of how the world is framed on a single foundation in which a fascinating house can be built. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching this. Again, unscripted, I went long, shocker of nobody, but hey, if you wanna check out more of my reviews or my most recent video essays, please make sure to actually go, give it a like, give it a subscribe, drop comments. I want to know your opinions on all this. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you all want to get involved in potentially seeing that new video essay that I have going live potentially tomorrow, want to see it live early or see any upcoming video essays early, please make sure to subscribe to my Patreon or YouTube members. There's also access to my schedule and access to my Discord, where you can argue with me a little bit more directly, but hey, the options are available. Don't feel obligated. Tough times out there, I understand. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.